We're going to review independent and dependent variables. As you watch this video, I'd like for you to take notes on your guided PowerPoint of things that either are extremely important or things that you didn't already know. So, math is really the study of problem solving. And any given problem situation typically presents a relationship with at least two variables. So when we talk about independent and dependent variables, we're talking about a problem situation that has two components. So how do you identify an independent variable? Well, the relationship between the two variables in a problem situation, the independent variable is the variable that stands alone, the one who is not affected by anything else that is changing in the problem. Contrast to that is the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the guy in the relationship that is changing or who is impacted by the independent variable. So I like to say that the dependent variable depends on something else. When you're looking at these problem situations, I want you to ask yourself, what depends on the other? That's a great way to identify independent and dependent. Let's take a look at a problem situation. In hockey, the number of goals a team has scored determines that team's score. Well, that's pretty simple. The number of goals you score determines your overall team score. So let's let G be the number of goals a team has scored, and let's let S be the team's score. How might you determine which of these variables is the independent and which one is the dependent? Take a moment and think about that. You can pause your video while you think. So what I'm thinking in my head is, which one of these variables depends on the other to happen? So does the number of goals depend on what our score is? Or does our score depend on the number of goals we've made? So if you look on the right side here, which statement is true? G is the independent and S is the dependent? Or S is the independent and G is the dependent? So if you said the team's score depends on how many goals our team has scored, you are correct. Therefore, our team's score is the dependent variable, and the goals we have scored is our independent, because the number of goals we score is not impacted by our score. Our score is impacted by how many goals we make. So G is the independent and S is the dependent. Go ahead and mark that on your sheet, please. I'd like for you to explain your thinking about that hockey problem now. So if you'll take just a moment and complete the sentences here. The dependent variable is our team's score because our score depends on how many goals our team makes. Therefore, the independent variable is the number of goals we score. Remember, you can always pause the video and rewind it if you need to catch something to take a note of it. Let's look at problem number 2 now. Remember, our goal is to distinguish which is independent and which is dependent. The problem situation says that a teller at a bank is tying bills into stacks. The number of bills on hand determines how many stacks the teller can make. So let B be the number of bills and S be the number of stacks. Which of the variables is independent and which is dependent? Explain your thinking. So what depends on what? The problem is pretty helpful because it tells you that the number of bills determines how many stacks. So how many stacks we make depends on how many bills we have. So it's probably safe to say that the number of bills we have is the independent variable, and the number of stacks we have is the dependent variable. So to explain your thinking, I want you to reflect back to that last sentence that you wrote. It should sound something like this. The dependent variable is the number of stacks that the teller can make because the number of bills determines how many stacks the teller can make. Therefore, the independent variable is the number of bills that the teller has on hand. Write that in your slide, please. Problem 3 says on your math quiz, you earn 5 points for each question that you answer correctly. Let Q represent the number of questions that you answer correctly, and let P represent the total number of points that you score. Which is independent and which is dependent? Pause the video and I want you to determine what is independent, what is dependent, and then give me a sentence to explain your thinking. So it makes sense that the number of questions that I answer correctly determines the total number of points that I score on the quiz. So since the number of points that I score depends on how many questions I answer correctly, I would say that the independent variable is the number of questions I answer correctly, and the dependent variable is the number of points or the total points I score on my quiz. All right, our last problem on the video says a committee is organizing music for the Apple Festival next month. They have 6 hours each day to schedule bands, and each band plays for approximately 30 minutes. How many bands can the committee schedule? Identify the independent and dependent variables and explain your reasoning. So there's clearly 2 things that are changing in this problem. That's the first thing that you need to identify. What are the 2 variables in this problem? And secondly, how can you justify the independent and dependent variables? I would like for you to go to the discussion board on Course Sites and justify, first of all, identify independent and dependent variables, And then explain your reasoning. Justify why you think the independent and the dependent are what they are. I look forward to reading your responses.